Jack could barely hear the radio through the roar of the rain beating against the windshield. The streetlights on either side of the road flickered faintly in the thick fog rising from the hot asphalt. It was getting dark. He was driving home after a long shift at the auto shop. Fatigue weighed down on his shoulders, and his eyelids felt heavy as lead. When the radio crackled and shut off, he just sighed. "And this too," he muttered under his breath and pressed the button to switch stations. But there was nothing, just a buzz and static. The thunder struck so hard that the car jolted, followed by a flash of lightning. For a second, everything around him lit up, and Jack noticed a figure on the side of the road. It stood motionless, in a long coat, its face hidden by a hood. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively slammed the brakes. The tires screeched, but he didn't come to a full stop, just slowed down. In the rearview mirror, the figure was still there, but another flash of lightning illuminated the road, and it was gone. He sped up. "I'm just imagining things." It was just a shadow. Jack reached the bridge over the river. The water below was raging from the downpour, and the wind swayed the old bridge. Here, he saw her again. The figure stood at the very edge of the road, near the guardrail. She lifted her head. Jack couldn't see her face, but he felt something cold crawl up his spine. Then she took a step forward. Right into the road. Jack jerked the steering wheel sharply, the tires screeching on the wet surface. The car skidded, and he almost crashed into the guardrail but managed to straighten the car. He was gasping for breath, sweat pouring into his eyes. And then he saw it in the mirror. The back door was slightly ajar. Something shifted inside. Jack stopped the car. He slowly turned, barely breathing. It was quiet behind him, in the darkness. But when the lightning struck again, he saw her. She was sitting right behind him. Jack gripped the steering wheel, his fingers white from the tension. The rain was pounding against the windshield, and the wipers barely managed to push the streams of water away. The radio was emitting a dull static, occasionally catching fragments of signals that drowned in the howling wind. He was heading home after a long shift at the auto shop on the outskirts of the city. He had to stay late today. The last customer had brought in an old pickup with a worn-out engine, and Jack, instead of turning it down, took on the job. He always did that. Extra money wouldn't hurt, and besides, he hated going back to an empty house earlier than necessary. His wife, Sarah, had passed away a year and a half ago. Since then, the house had become nothing more than a place to sleep, cold as the loneliness that ate away at him from the inside. He worked until exhaustion to avoid being alone with his thoughts. Tonight felt especially eerie. The storm had started an hour ago when he was leaving the city, and with each passing minute, it grew stronger. Lightning flashed continuously, lighting up the wet road. He could barely see the roadside, only the grim silhouettes of trees bending under the pressure of the wind. Suddenly, the radio crackled and then went silent. Jack tapped the panel, but it was useless. Shit. Just then, a lightning strike illuminated the road ahead, and he saw someone on the side of the road. The figure stood motionless, dressed in a long black coat. A deep hood concealed its face. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He almost drove past, but something made him slam on the brakes. He looked around. The figure was gone. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "You're just tired. You're imagining things." He pressed the gas, trying to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. But just a few minutes later, he saw her again. This time, right in front of the bridge. Jack could barely breathe when he saw the figure again. It stood at the very edge of the road near the bridge, as if waiting for him. He slammed the gas pedal, eager to speed past. The road was slick, and the car slid a bit, but he managed to maintain control. "Just keep going. Don't stop." But as he got closer, the unknown figure took a step forward. "Shit!" Jack shouted and sharply turned the wheel. The tires lost grip on the wet asphalt. The car skidded to the side. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to crash into the guardrail and tumble into the river. Instinctively, he jerked the steering wheel in the opposite direction and slammed on the brakes. The car stopped abruptly. Jack gasped for air. His hands were shaking, and his heart pounded wildly in his chest. He looked around. The figure was gone. It hadn't just moved or run away. It was gone. The thunder rumbled, tearing through the silence. Another flash of lightning, and for a few seconds, everything around him was flooded with a harsh white light. The back door was slightly open. A cold fear ran down his spine. He didn't even feel the rain running down his face. Slowly, as if in a dream, he turned his gaze to the rearview mirror. Darkness. But something was there. Jack could feel it. He steeled himself and cautiously reached for the interior light. He pressed the button. The cabin was bathed in a yellowish glow. Empty. Jack exhaled sharply and slumped against the seat, struggling to calm himself. Damned storm, he muttered, trying to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was just nerves. Fatigue. He reached for the door handle to close it. But before he touched it, he heard a faint sound behind him. Breathing. Deep. Slow. Right behind him. A cold wave of fear washed over Jack. His body was paralyzed with tension, he couldn't even move. The breathing behind him was quiet, but clear. Slow, drawn-out inhales and exhales, as if someone was sitting in the darkness, watching him. He didn't want to turn around. But he couldn't help it. He had to turn around. With trembling fingers, he reached for the rearview mirror. He barely turned it. And saw the eyes. Two dark eyes staring directly at him from the back seat. The face, hidden in shadow, was featureless, but the eyes. They were wrong. Deep, empty, like two holes in the world. Jack instinctively recoiled forward and hit his head on the steering wheel. The car horn pierced the night, but it didn't scare whatever was behind him. He broke free from the panic, leaped out of the car, stumbled, and nearly fell onto the wet asphalt. Thunder rumbled above, lightning illuminating the empty road. He walked around the car, peering inside. The cabin was empty. No one was there. His heart raced wildly. He ran a hand across his wet face, trying to exhale. I'm losing it. But the door was still open. He remembered hearing the breathing. He had seen those eyes. Suddenly, from behind the trees, the crunch of branches broke the silence. Jack looked up. In the darkness, someone was standing. A new flash of lightning split the sky. And he saw her. The figure stood on the side of the road, a few meters from the car. The same long coat, the hood hiding her face. She was moving closer. Jack darted back to the car, slammed the door, and pressed the gas pedal. The tires screeched on the wet road as the car surged forward. He didn't want to know what it was anymore. He just wanted to get out of there. But when he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw that she was already sitting in the back seat. She leaned forward. Her cold whisper mixed with the storm's roar. You brought me home. Jack screamed and swerved the wheel. The car slid, nearly throwing him off the road, but he regained control. Get out of my car, he yelled, not even thinking about what to do next. But the figure behind him didn't move. She just sat there, leaning forward, her hood nearly touching his shoulder. You brought me home, she repeated, and in her voice, there was no anger, only cold, horrifying resignation. No. No. Jack sped off, not knowing where he was going. Just away from the bridge, away from this nightmare. He looked in the mirror again. She was no longer there. His fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly, his lungs struggling to catch enough air. This isn't real. It's shock. I'm just tired. Finally, he saw his street. The house with the dim porch light. He stopped at the entrance, quickly turned off the engine, and jumped out of the car, leaving the doors open. The darkness inside the cabin looked menacing. Jack stood in the rain, trying to calm down. His breathing gradually evened out. It was a hallucination. Just fatigue, shock, nerves. He walked around the car and peered through the window. Nothing. The back seat was empty. Jack nervously chuckled. It really was just a figment of his imagination. He slammed the door, approached the house, and inserted the key into the lock. Silence. He stepped inside, shook off the water, and took off his shoes. The dim light in the hallway flickered faintly. Jack caught his breath, then walked into the living room. It was cold and lifeless, as always. He ran a hand over his face and walked to the fridge to pour himself some water. When he turned around, she was sitting at the table. Her hood was off. He saw Sarah, her eyes were as empty as in the mirror of the car. Her pale face, hair wet from the rain, she was staring at him. "I told you I'd wait." The light in the house flickered. Jack didn't have time to scream the next morning. The neighbors saw his car by the house. The doors were open. No one was inside. Jack was never seen again. It was the kind of night when the weather seemed to press in on you, thick and heavy, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Claire had just finished her late shift at the hospital and was heading home, the storm already creeping in from the horizon. The radio crackled in her car, the reception worsening as the first raindrops began to splatter against her windshield. She glanced at the weather forecast on her phone. A thunderstorm was predicted, though the forecasters had given it little attention. There was no warning of what was to come. No one had anticipated the storm's ferocity. The city streets were already slick with rain, the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the sky in harsh, white streaks. Claire felt a strange unease creeping up her spine as the storm intensified, her hands tightening on the steering wheel as she maneuvered through the wet roads. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the rain that seemed to fall in torrents, each gust of wind making the trees along the roadside sway ominously. At the first sign of a particularly loud crack of thunder, Claire flinched, her foot pressing harder on the accelerator. The old sedan she drove was no match for the speed of the storm, but she tried to keep her pace steady, knowing her small house on the outskirts of town would provide her refuge once she got there. As she turned down the familiar road leading to her home, the streetlights flickered twice and went out, leaving her in total darkness except for the occasional flash of lightning that split the night. The road was narrow here, lined with dense trees, their branches heavy with rain. It felt as if the storm had swallowed the world around her, the sense of isolation growing thicker with each passing second. She hadn't driven this way in a while, as her work had kept her later than usual for the past few weeks. It was strange to think that, for all the times she had driven down this road, she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this uneasy. It was just a thunderstorm, after all. But there was something unsettling about it. She hadn't noticed the small figure by the side of the road until she was almost upon it. A man, standing in the rain, his back to her, completely still. He was dressed in dark clothing, his hood pulled low over his face. The moment she saw him, Claire's heart skipped a beat, a visceral chill running through her. Something about the figure didn't seem right. Her instinct screamed at her to look away, to keep driving, to just get home and forget about it. But her foot hesitated over the brake. Before she could make any sense of it, the man slowly turned to face her. In the split second of shock, Claire's hand jerked on the wheel. She swerved, narrowly avoiding the man, but in that moment of panic, the car slid off the road, tires skimming over the muddy shoulder. The next thing she knew, the car had come to a violent stop against a tree. She sat in stunned silence for a moment, trying to regain her bearings. Her heart raced. It took her several seconds to realize the engine was still running, the headlights casting eerie shadows across the trees. The rain outside intensified, and another thunderclap rattled the windows. Claire wiped her hands nervously across her face. Her heart still pounding, she glanced at the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind her. The road, the men, nothing. The storm roared on, deafeningly loud. After taking a deep breath, Claire shifted the car into reverse, attempting to move it back onto the road. But as she turned the wheel, something caught her eye through the rearview mirror. A figure. It was standing in the middle of the road now, just behind her. He was tall, but his face remained hidden in shadow. She froze. The man had moved with impossible speed. There was no way he could have reached her car so quickly. Claire's hands trembled as she fumbled for the gearshift, but the engine sputtered and died. Panic gripped her chest. She was about to get out of the car when the thunder cracked again, this time deafening, and for just a fraction of a second, the figure disappeared in a flash of lightning. She blinked, the storm blinding her for that split second. When her eyes cleared, he was gone. But there was no relief. She sat in the car, waiting, listening to the howling wind and relentless rain. Time seemed to stretch, the storm outside becoming louder and more chaotic. Another bolt of lightning lit up the sky, casting stark shadows across the forest around her. Suddenly, there was a soft tapping on the window. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She dared not turn her head, terrified of what she might see. The tapping came again, louder this time. Slowly, she turned her head toward the window. There, pressed against the glass, was the figure. His face was just inches from hers. His skin was pale and slick with rain, his eyes wide and empty. Claire screamed. But before she could even move, the car jolted forward, as if something had yanked it. She slammed her foot on the brake, but the car continued to move, slowly pulling out onto the road as if guided by some unseen force. The storm raged on, deafening. She gripped the steering wheel with all her strength, eyes darting back and forth between the road and the rearview mirror. Behind her, the figure remained there, only now, he was walking alongside the car, his face pressed against the glass. His lips curled into a grin, and he whispered something, but Claire could only hear the deafening roar of the storm over his words. By the time she reached her house, the figure was gone. But the storm. It didn't stop. Not that night, nor the next. And when Claire went into her house, the air felt thick, too still, as though something had shifted in the very fabric of her reality. The thunderstorm had come with a warning, one she couldn't ignore. It had found her. Claire's heart was still pounding as she stepped into her house. The oppressive, thick air clung to her skin, making her feel as though she couldn't breathe. She locked the door behind her, her trembling hands fumbling with the deadbolt. The world outside felt like it had been swallowed whole by the storm, and for a moment, she wondered if it had swallowed her sanity too. The house was silent, eerily so. She had always loved the stillness when the storm raged outside, the way it made her feel safe, wrapped in the warmth of her small, familiar space. But tonight, that silence felt wrong. As though something was waiting just outside the edges of the dark, waiting for her to let her guard down. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, its hands moving far too slowly. She walked into the living room, glancing out the window at the torrential downpour that had taken over the world outside. Every now and then, a flash of lightning would split the sky, illuminating the silhouettes of the trees and casting erratic shadows across her walls. She went to the kitchen, needing something to steady her nerves. She poured herself a glass of water, her hands still unsteady. The cold liquid did little to calm her racing pulse, but it gave her something to focus on. Suddenly, there was a noise from upstairs. A creak. Then another. She froze, the glass in her hand shaking. There was no reason for anyone to be in the house. She lived alone. Her breath caught in her throat as the creaking continued, each step slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking. No, sneaking, through her house. Claire set the glass down with a soft clink and stood in the kitchen, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on her, the wind howling outside, but the sound inside felt even worse. Slowly, she moved toward the stairs, every footstep a quiet echo in the otherwise still house. Each creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet seemed impossibly loud in the silence. Another noise. Closer this time. Her breath hitched as she reached the bottom of the stairs. She didn't know what she was expecting, but it certainly wasn't the darkness that greeted her when she looked up. The hallway above her was completely black, save for the faint light spilling in from the window at the far end of the corridor. And then she saw it. A figure, just barely visible at the top of the stairs. It was the same man. The same shadowy figure she had seen on the side of the road. But now, his face was clearer. His skin pale, his eyes empty, hollow sockets that seemed to stare right through her. His mouth twisted into a grin, though his eyes never blinked, never moved. Claire's legs felt like they might give out beneath her. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure didn't move, it just stood there, staring down at her from the top of the stairs. Her breath was coming in shallow gasps now, her hands clammy, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. She didn't know what to do. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor, like she was rooted in place by the weight of his gaze. For a long, unbearable moment, neither of them moved. And then, the man's voice broke the silence. "You brought me here," he whispered, his voice hollow, as if it came from somewhere far away. Claire wanted to bolt, to run from this nightmare, but something kept her frozen, her mind trying to make sense of the words, of the situation. How did he know? How could he be here, in her home, after everything that had happened? Before she could react, another flash of lightning illuminated the hallway, and in that split second, the figure was gone. As though he had never been there. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. But the storm didn't let up. The wind howled louder, the thunder crackling like a war drum, and the rain slammed against the windows in an unrelenting frenzy. Claire sat there, trying to breathe, her mind spinning. It felt like the storm was pulling her into something dark, something that didn't want to let her go. She couldn't stay in the house anymore. She couldn't stay where he had been. She had to get out. But where would she go? There was no escape from the storm. It had already found her. With trembling hands, Claire grabbed her coat and hurried outside, ignoring the cold rain as it soaked through her clothes. The air was thick with the electricity of the storm, and the night seemed to hum with energy. The world was distorted, as if the very fabric of reality had shifted. She ran to her car, her mind racing, but when she got inside and slammed the door shut, she realized something. The storm was still here. Still waiting. Claire looked into the rearview mirror. The figure stood there. The man. Standing in the back seat, his eyes locked on her. She didn't scream. She didn't move. She just stared back, her heart racing as the storm raged on. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking. But he didn't answer. Instead, he simply smiled, and the thunder boomed louder, shaking the car, rattling the very air around her. And in that moment, Claire knew something she couldn't deny. The storm had come for her. And it wasn't going to stop until it had claimed everything. The man in the back seat didn't speak, but his grin was unnerving, wide and twisted. Claire's heart raced in her chest as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She couldn't breathe. The air in the car felt too thick, too oppressive, like something was closing in around her. Her instincts screamed at her to drive, to escape, but her body refused to obey. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the mirror. The figure sat motionless, his face only inches from hers. The rain slapped against the windshield, so heavy that it seemed like the storm itself was pushing her into the car. With a sudden jolt, Claire snapped out of her trance. She slammed the car into drive and floored the pedal. The tires screeched, spinning on the wet road, but she didn't care. She needed to get away. She had to outrun whatever this was, whatever it wanted from her. The car lurched forward, sliding slightly on the slick pavement. She turned the wheel sharply, almost losing control as she rounded the corner. The storm raged louder, the wind howling like a beast behind her. But in the rearview mirror, the figure remained. No escape. She glanced at the side mirror for a split second, just enough time for the shadow to move, just enough time for her to see its dark form shift and bend. The man wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing. And his eyes were locked on hers. A cold chill crept up Claire's spine, and she screamed, more in frustration than fear, before her foot slammed harder on the gas pedal. Faster. Get away. The road ahead stretched out before her like a never-ending tunnel, lit by only the occasional flash of lightning. Her hands shook, her pulse racing. The storm seemed to be chasing her now, the air thick and heavy with static, but she couldn't tell if it was just her imagination, or if the storm itself was alive, angry, closing in on her. As she reached the edge of town, she saw it, the bridge. The same bridge she had crossed that night. The one that had been so familiar, yet now felt like an omen. The bridge was the final stretch, and she had to cross it. But she couldn't. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror again. The man had vanished. For a brief moment, relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. A sound, distant yet unmistakable, echoed through the storm, a low, guttural chuckle. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. Suddenly, the car's headlights flickered. Once. Twice. The bridge was closer now, but her car wasn't moving the way it should. The steering wheel felt like it was fighting her, the car swerving in tiny, uncontrollable movements. She slammed her foot on the brake, but the car didn't stop. She tried to turn the wheel to avoid the barrier, but it wouldn't budge. The figure was there, standing on the bridge, illuminated by the headlights for just a fraction of a second. Then, a violent force jerked the car forward. The brakes screamed in protest as the car spun, the road turning into a blur of white and black. The thunder crackled above her like 1,000 gunshots. With a deafening crash, the car hit the railing, and everything went dark. When Claire opened her eyes, she was no longer in the car. She was standing in the middle of the road, drenched by the downpour. The storm still raged above her, but there was no sign of her car, no wreckage, nothing. The figure stood before her, as if waiting for her to wake up. "You brought me home," he whispered again, his voice like a cold wind. "Just as you always do." Claire's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't speak. Her throat was dry. She was paralyzed, unable to move. "Now it's your turn," he said softly, his voice distant, fading into the storm. And then, the figure stepped toward her, disappearing into the darkness of the night. The storm grew louder, the wind howling in her ears, as if it were swallowing the world whole. And Claire realized, this was where it had always been leading. Not away from the storm, but into it. As the storm took her, Claire finally understood the truth. There was no escape. Not from the storm. Not from him. And now, she was part of it.